So the Sikh Human Rights Group proudly presents our Environmental and Diversity Speaker Series. Today's topic, addressing climate change through the lens of environmental geography. Today you'll be listening to Professor Mistry from Royal Holloway University in London, whose research interests include environmental management and governance, participatory visual methods and Indigenous geographies. Her work involves supporting local livelihoods and biodiversity conservation, action research using participatory video, and capacity building for natural resource management. She is also concerned with fire management in tropical savannas, particularly the social-ecological interactions and policy implications. Finally, but amongst various other matters, she is also the coordinator of an ongoing Darwin Initiative entitled Integrating Traditional Knowledge into National Policy and Practice in Guyana. Recorded live on the 11th of August 2021, this is the seventh podcast in Sikh Human Rights Group's 2021 Environmental and Diversity Speaker Series. Welcome, Professor Mistry, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for inviting me.
More than welcome. Professor, could I please ask you to begin by telling our audience a little bit about the invaluable environmental protection work that you and your colleagues have done in the past and are currently undertaking?
Yeah, so I suppose thinking about the kind of work I'm doing, I can probably start with the kind of conservation work that I've been doing mostly in Guyana, and it's kind of based around looking at how different types of knowledge systems can contribute to conservation. And I suppose I'm actually trained as a natural scientist. So I did my first degree in biology. I then did my my PhD in physical geography, which was very much a natural science kind of based disciplines. And I didn't actually talk to anybody in those cases. And it was only towards the end of my PhD that I started realizing that actually any kind of environmental management, in the case of my PhD, I was working on fire, any kind of environmental management really had to involve local people in the conversation. It wasn't just possible for scientists to be able to do their ecological surveys, like for example what I was doing, and then expect those kinds of things to be put into practice without the collaboration of local people. So that's how I kind of started moving then into more kind of what I call environmental geography, which is very much a kind of like combining the social and the natural together. And so in terms of the kind of conservation work I've done, it is very much kind of having that grounding in the natural sciences and understanding the systems from a kind of ecological perspective, but also trying to incorporate the multiple stakeholders or interest groups. And particularly my focus has been on local communities, the people who actually live and rely on those resources, and how do you incorporate their interests, but also their worldviews, and also ensuring that there is some sort of equity in terms of the benefits that people get from the environment. We talk a lot about kind of like, I suppose, going back to the topics of climate change that I know is part of this kind of podcast. There is a lot of talk about, for example, conserving forests as a way of mitigating against climate change. And there's a lot of different types of mechanisms in place or being proposed. So for example, there is the reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. So this REDD+ scheme, which is part of international mechanisms in terms of trying to mitigate against climate change. And some of those involve having to keep forests standing and paying countries at the national level to keep those forests intact, which sounds like a great idea, and perhaps it is, but at the end of the day, we have to also think about who's getting the benefits from the financial transactions that will happen through those mechanisms. And are the local people, the people who actually care for and are the stewards of those forests, what kind of benefits are they going to get? How is that money actually, the idea is the trickle down effect, isn't it? That the national governments will receive this money and it will trickle down to the local people. But yeah, how that happens in practice is yet to be kind of properly kind of conceived and evaluated, because past experience has shown that that doesn't always happen properly and doesn't always happen fairly and equitably. So I think that is one of the things that I'm kind of really interested in terms of kind of looking at how issues of equity and how different kinds of mechanisms can be put in place to make sure that local knowledge systems can be incorporated into conservation. So I suppose, yeah, my work is very much a mixture of the kind of scientific, but also bringing in the different people's perspectives and into that. So yeah, so going back to the Guyana and the work I've done in conservation, you mentioned the project, the Darwin Initiative project that I've got. That's actually now finished. It finished last month. It was a 4-year project funded by the UK government, Darwin Initiative, very much doing what I was kind of just explaining, trying to get Indigenous communities who live in and around protected areas in Guyana to get their voices more into conservation. And in that project, we were doing that in a very varied numbers of ways. So we use participatory videos. So again, you mentioned in my little bio that I do participatory visual methods. So it's kind of like looking at ways in which to engage with local communities in ways that could be more aligned with their worldviews and their modes of communication. Sometimes as academics or scientists, when we go in, we don't always have the right methods, or we may think that the ways that we want to engage with communities might be working, but sometimes they are not always appropriate for the local context. And so in terms of Indigenous communities who have a very kind of very relational kind of way of thinking about the world, relations with each other, but relations with nature, relations with spiritual worlds as well. And so kind of that relational sense and the kind of visual and the oral communication that they rely on actually aligns quite well with the kind of visual approaches that we've been doing. So using participatory video has been one of the main tools in that project that we've been doing. I've been using participatory video for a number of years in previous projects. And so we train local community researchers in the different communities that we worked with in and around Guyana, all around Guyana, to take videos in their communities about the ways in which they maintain and protect the biodiversity and the kinds of ways that their kind of day-to-day or livelihood activities that are actually maintaining the environment. And then so that was one of the bits of work that we did. And then as part of that project, we also looked at different kinds of ways that local communities perceive their traditional knowledge. So, what are what we call kind of indicators, I suppose, of traditional knowledge, but from the perspective of Indigenous peoples, basically. So what do they see as the important aspects of their traditional knowledge? And then we tried to evaluate the status of that using a kind of qualitative method of kind of like, how is it working very well? Is it, not working too good? Is it stable? Is it bad? So they kind of did a kind of qualitative evaluation of these different aspects of their traditional knowledge. And in that way, we were able to develop these kinds of baselines to kind of say, well, okay, for example, the Makushi group or the Wapishana group or the YY or the different groups that we are working with, how they themselves evaluate or assess their kind of level of knowledge. And so that was kind of part of the work that we were doing in terms of trying to involve communities, Indigenous communities, in assessing their own traditional knowledge, rather than necessarily it being just people coming in, scientists coming in to assess that, but actually getting them to assess that. And that whole process of doing that is also a process of reflection. So through the videos, you make the videos, but the videos also then screened within the community several times, and people can add information into it, but it also forms the basis of discussion within the community. It can also form a kind of a process of kind of reflecting on yourself and how you thinking about what's happening in the community, how could we make things better, what things are we doing here that are really well that we could potentially share with other people. So the participatory video itself is it's not just about making videos, it's all about, it's a process basically that through that video making, you're able to do lots of different types of evaluation and assessment and reflection. And then one of the other things that we were doing in this process is actually trying to get decision makers, so people who like are protected areas authorities or ministries, to kind of not act on those, but to kind of watch those videos and kind of think about what are some of the issues. So going back to the issues of equity that I was mentioning before, one of the there are kind of number of different aspects to equity that we can think about. You know, there's the kind of, there's the element of recognition. So actually, you know, where you recognize different people's knowledge systems and different people's values and worldviews, that in itself is a form of equity. So the idea of recognition. And then there's also things to do with participation. You know, how do people actually participate in processes to do with decision-making, political processes, whatever it might be. And again, that is a form of equity. Not everybody participates. So that is not, and you know, that's an issue of inequity as well. And then there's also obviously the distributional aspects, and that's to do with finance and distribution of benefits. So there's these three different types of elements of equity, and we were kind of using video as a way of producing a dialogue or facilitating a dialogue between communities who live in quite remote areas of the world, of Guyana, who don't always have access to decision makers or not able to travel to the capital, for example, or potentially don't even have the confidence to kind of, you know, to approach those kinds of people to talk about their concerns and their issues. So using the video as what we call in a process of video mediated dialogue, where the video is the mediator to produce this dialogue. So some of these videos made by the communities were screened to the decision makers. And then within that, we have like a discussion with the decision makers. And then we produce a response video. So where the decision makers produce a response, which is then taken back to the community. So it's this idea of a two-way dialogue between communities and decision makers. And again, so it's this idea of kind of building this equity, building this idea of recognition, i.e. there are different ways of viewing the world, viewing nature, viewing conservation, you know, building equity in terms of thinking about participation. How can Indigenous communities participate more in those processes of deliberation? And then also distributional. So kind of like had examples of where some of the communities were talking about, you know, concerns they had about the way that certain types of benefits were being shared from the protected areas. And we were able to take some of those concerns to those protected areas managers, and they were able to then respond to that, you know, in terms of kind of thinking about what kind of actions could we take to kind of address some of these issues. So yeah, so that's, I suppose I'm kind of in a roundabout way, I don't know if I answered your question, but kind of like telling you about some of the things that we've been working with in terms of conservation and protection of, I wouldn't say just environment, but obviously the linked human and environmental issues. And then the second part is that, as you said, I have a very strong interest in fire as well. So fire is something that I've been working on since my PhD. And I'm one of the associate directors of the Leverhulme Wildfire Centre. It's a 10-year project that started last year, funded by the Leverhulme Trust in the UK. And the aim of the centre is to really think about wildfires and fire management in general around the world, and think about how we can better live with fire. So, you know, fire is something, as we see today in the news, this week, it's all been about fires in Greece, Italy, Turkey. These fires aren't going to go away, you know, with climate change and all the other issues that are going on, with something we're going to have to live with. So part of the work that I do is kind of trying to think about, how do we do that? How can we draw on, for example, Indigenous knowledge? So part of my work on fire has worked with Indigenous communities, looking at how they traditionally managed fire in their landscape and how that was beneficial both to themselves and to the landscape, and helped to prevent wildfires. So some of the wildfires that we're seeing today are a result of colonial policies that were put in place that actually prevented Indigenous people from burning the landscapes. But maybe we can talk a bit more about that later on, depending. Yeah, otherwise I've talked a lot already.
No, thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Rai, could I please ask you to briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that the Sikh Human Rights Group has been doing over the years to promote our notion of pluralism?
Yeah, the Sikh Human Rights Group started in 1985, and in 1998 we looked at environmental issues and participated at the World Conference on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. 2015, we managed to get consultative status at the UN, and then pushed our agenda even more. One of the things that the UN was doing was trying to create a universal ethics of environment around 2008, etc. And we took the position that this universalism is perhaps one of the problems in the modern world, that different civilization, cultures, and belief systems have very different approaches to environment. They have long, hundreds of years of wisdom, which are not necessarily the same, say, in India or Africa or South America. And we can't impose one sort of ethical systems in, for instance, the West or and Middle East. There is the concept of custodianship, whereas in others there is a deeper relationship, spiritual relationship with the environment. And we then have been pushing for a plural approach to the whole environmental issues, not just based on this idea of fear of the world ending in a few years' time, but also complementing this with civilizations which have a more, as you said, relationship or empathy with the environment as part of their cultures, and bring them on fore as well. The rest of the world can benefit from them or may not benefit. You know, every civilization may have its own way of approaching it, but there isn't one unique way, one single way of looking at that. So that's in a nutshell. We take a much more plural approach to the whole environmental crisis, and we are trying to encourage people from different areas, different regions of the world to dig their wisdoms and bring them forth in a way. I think one thing puts it in context. If you look at Abrahamic traditions, they tend to be, there's a fear of God, and that seems to be very much part of the traditions in Western modern politics as well. It's fearing the state, fearing this, fearing that. And if you tell the average Western or Middle Eastern person that the world is going to end in 30 years, they can empathize with that. Whereas if you tell the average Indian in India that the world is going to end in 30 years, they say, well, they believe in reincarnation. They also believe there are many universes. They will say, if it's the karma of the world, what can I do? My soul is going to go somewhere else. So that's what we're saying. The universal language doesn't really work in many other civilizations. And to empower civil society, you have to bring different linguistic tools, different cultural traditions, and different wisdoms on the table.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. As always, we're going to begin today's discussion by delving into a variety of prominent environmental questions. I'm then going to give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Bethan Walters, who will ask you a few questions on diversity and inclusion related matters. My first question for you, therefore, Professor Mistry, is, do you believe that there is scope to integrate Indigenous and or traditional knowledge systems from around the globe into our domestic legislation, policy and practice, particularly in regards to what must now become a national effort to mitigate and adapt to the negative impacts of climate change?
Yes, definitely, is the answer to that. You know, just kind of, I suppose, going back to the example that I was giving to you before about the work from the Darwin Initiative that I've been doing with colleagues and partners in Guyana. One of the big outcomes of that has been actually a traditional knowledge national action plan. So we've actually been working using the information that we've been collecting, and we call it an evidence-based approach. So we've collected evidence from the Indigenous communities around Guyana about their traditional knowledge, so they're indicators about how they feel, what are the things that matter, what are the things that are part of their traditional knowledge, what do they think is the status of that, as well as the videos and the information from the videos. And we have pulled that all together into this action plan. And the action plan is based on a number of things in terms of recognition, as we go back to those issues of equity I was talking about, but also rights of Indigenous communities. And there is a number of actions in there that we have developed together with those communities. And it was, I mean, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we weren't able to do the consultation as widely as we wanted to, but luckily restrictions were lifted in Guyana towards the beginning of this year. So we were able to do a process of national consultation on this policy, and that has now been done, and it's all been incorporated together. And so we're just kind of waiting to basically hand over this policy to the government. I mean, the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs is actually one of our partners in this project. So it's not like an official handing over, but it's a kind of more of a kind of recognition that this document is now kind of complete in terms of the work we can do on it as a project. And it's really kind of handing it over to give that ownership to the Guyanese government. But definitely, yes, Indigenous knowledge and local community traditional knowledge can be incorporated into policy, into domestic policies, as I've explained in terms of this case. I think there's also an element of thinking about how you can put that into other kinds of policies. So, for example, one of the projects I've done in the past was in Venezuela. We were looking at how Indigenous knowledge could be better incorporated into climate change plans and climate change mitigation policies, and we were kind of bringing climate change scientists as well as staff from different kinds of agencies together with Indigenous leaders to kind of talk through. And I think one of the big steps, I think, or one of the kind of first steps, is really to kind of bring these different groups of people together to kind of give different knowledge systems a kind of level playing field, because whatever we think, science is always going to be the top dog basically in terms of knowledge systems. And really, in order to get different types of perspectives and knowledges on the table, you've got to bring these groups of people together to be able to talk in kind of some sort of common language. We kind of, in the academic work that I've done, we kind of called that intercultural governance. So this idea of governance with different types of cultures, going back to very much what was just said about, thinking about different people's worldviews, that not everybody views the world in the same way, or may not even view the future or the past in the same way, and kind of bringing that together. So yes, I think definitely we can do that. And I have already kind of done work on that. One is the very practical traditional knowledge national action plan for Guyana, but also just bringing Indigenous voices into the kind of policy arena and trying to really get those ideas into policy. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Dr. Rai, can I put the same question to you, please?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting listening to Professor Mistry and how this has been done in Guyana and to some extent in Venezuela. One of our affiliates is the Indigenous Knowledge Systems Department at the KwaZulu University in South Africa, in Durban. And they have also, interestingly, they started this the same proposal quite a number of years ago, and they started with the traditional medicine to incorporate that into the modern medical infrastructure, so that people in villages, etc., when they're looked after, their traditional doctors, the doctors are aware when to escalate it to, let us say, hospitals and things like that. Because otherwise people get divided between traditional medicine or modern medicine. Mm-hmm. And now they started looking at the environment, and they've done similar sort of work to some extent, and they're trying to influence not just South Africa, many other African countries. I think there's been generally a resistance by many countries yet, or they don't know how to incorporate this. And I think the work you're doing, from what I hear, is invaluable, because I think there is a need for governments to understand how to incorporate that into policy. Governments are too obsessed with GDP growth and competing with each other at the expense of what already exists, at the expense of contentment. And I think sometimes one envies a country like Bhutan, which is not that obsessed with the technology and GDPs, but has perhaps one of the highest rates of contentment in the world. Yeah, I think that there is a role but how we cross that barrier that governments have created for themselves? How to create those mechanisms? Even in UK, there's a lot of traditional knowledge that is more or less dead now, I think. But why not? Why not? After all, the traditional wisdom, or the wisdom that existed in the world, has enabled humankind to survive for thousands of years, and now within 100 years, we are on the brink of extinction. So we have to look back. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just also just add to what you were saying there? I think, you know, for example, in the case of when we were doing the work in Guyana, we kind of are looking at some of the initiatives in terms of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and you know, when governments have to report on the targets. So, for example, the Aichi targets, biodiversity targets, which were the last round. Obviously, they're in the process of producing a new framework for biodiversity. But for those targets, so if you look at target 18, which is the target for traditional knowledge, so they actually have a target or had a target, and you look at how different countries report on those targets, you can see that in a lot of cases, I would say probably the majority of cases, it's very ad hoc in terms of the reporting. It's like, oh, there was one project here about traditional knowledge, or there was one project here about this, or there was one, you know, there's no kind of joined up thinking in terms of, well, actually, it's not about this little project here or this little project there, but actually at the national level, how are we working with all Indigenous groups within our country in terms of thinking about how that traditional knowledge contributes not only to their cultures, but also to biodiversity and conservation and climate change mitigation. So I think one of the unique things that I think as well of the work that we've been doing in Guyana has been that it's actually an effort at the national level to actually join the dots up, rather than being a kind of little tiny project on one particular aspect with one little group kind of thing, but is actually trying to look at how can you do this at national level. Therefore, how can you then put that into more, how can you then link that into other kinds of policies at the national level? So once you have this policy for traditional knowledge, for example, at a national level, you can then start plugging that into sustainable development goals, you can plug that into climate change mitigation policies. So that's the thing that I think we need to kind of think at that higher scale, as you're saying.
Thank you very much, panelists. That was extremely thought-provoking. My next question is, what are the greatest challenges that our global community faces when it comes to combating and redressing climate change and/or achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, and how can they be overcome? And Professor Mistry, as you've touched on it before, can I ask you to go first?
Yes, that's a really big question. It's like, oh my gosh. And I think, you know, for me, I think one of the biggest issues that we have in terms of climate change and all the kinds of issues that are happening is that, and we've seen the report that's come out this week again from the IPCC, you know, telling us that we're running out of time, but in a way, we know that we've been running out of time for decades. We've been knowing we've been running out of time. So it's just like the same message kind of thing. And you just think, well, okay, when is anyone actually going to do something about this? So, you know, I think we can't really think about climate change and sustainable development goals just on their own. I think we need to really think about system change. And what we mean by this is like something kind of more radical. It's where like the whole system needs to change in some sort of way, you know. So it's a kind of thinking much more kind of holistically about the issues, how they're kind of linked together. And actually, yeah, I don't know. I just feel that it's something so much more fundamental than just climate change or development goals. I think it's kind of like, it's like they're in this kind of bigger thing, which is kind of the whole system of the way that we work in the world needs to change. You know, we just need to kind of think. And I think, as was touched on just before, it's all about growth and making profits. And, you know, that's the fundamental thing that needs to change. I think if we can think about a different way, a different trajectory, you know, a different goal, you know, is it contentment? Is it well-being? What is it that we want to work towards? Then I think we can really think about how to address some of these issues. But I think at the moment it's, yeah, we're kind of like have these like little packages of things, and I just feel that things are not really joining up properly in terms of thinking about what the bigger issue is. You know, I was just thinking, there was reading the other day that, you know, we in the UK are holding the next COP for climate change in Glasgow. And there's a lot of talk from the UK government about all the great things that we're going to do and all the targets we're going to reach and stuff. But at the same time, they've given new leases on oil and gas fields, you know, to go ahead. I mean, it just seems like a contradiction. I mean, you know, so I think it's just, it just seems like we've just got to really think about a kind of more system change rather than some of those kind of like smaller things. I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, perfect sense, and I for one wholeheartedly agree with you. Dr. Rai, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think Professor Mistry has put it in context. I think part of the problem with the UN is that it's a state-based institution, and the emphasis is more on states, what states can do, and then what transnational corporations can do, what businesses can do, because that's what states are obsessed with. There isn't that much of an involvement of civil society and traditional groups. And I think if anything, that could change in COP26 is if an equal time to exactly the sort of work that you're doing, and to bring that on the fore and say, look, this, you know, there is an alternative way of looking at this. We can't keep on just chasing rationally about reducing carbon emissions and all that, because every country is positioning itself on when and how much carbon emission it is going to reduce. You know, some are saying by 2050, some are saying by 2060, some are 2030. But the crisis is now, and unless people take ownership and people are given that empowerment, people are given recognition, I don't think governments are going to speed up this. So it's a really, I think there needs to be a sort of a shift, as you say, both within the UN and the whole climate change debate. It has to be refocused on civil society, on people as well.
Yeah, totally. And I just think, you know, there's a lot of talk after the report came out was very much about the technological fix. So, you know, there's always this kind of fixation on technology is going to save us, you know, and and for sure we've got things like renewables, and we can definitely do stuff on renewables, but it's got to be more than just that. It can't be just we've all got to switch to green energy, or we've all got to use less plastic, or we've all got to, because that is only part of the solution. I mean, the best solution would be that we don't have any plastic, or that we just consume much less, or, you know, so I think there's got to be a much more radical system change, I think.
Thank you very much, panelists. My next question is, in your expert opinions, what should ordinary or non-expert members of our global society do when they think newly enacted environmental policies or laws are unethical or unjust? And as always, Professor Mistry, if I could ask you to go first.
Yeah, I think it's really hard when you think of like, okay, well, you know, if you think a policy is unjust, what can you do? I mean, I think going back to what was just said, I think one of the things that, you know, people can do is actually they can mobilize and do something themselves, you know, and you've seen that there are a lot of people that, you know, around the world who are trying to just take things into their own hands, because sometimes it's not really possible in terms of trying to, you know, what can you do? You could democratically try to vote out your politicians and your government if you didn't believe in the kinds of policies that they were doing, especially their ethical or their environmental policies. But that's a long-term solution, isn't it? Voting comes around every 4 years and it doesn't always work like that. But I think maybe we're talking going back to civil society and the role of civil society and how people can take more ownership and maybe mobilize much more at the local scale and try to think about ways in which they can mitigate, or that they can actually, you know, try to change the system, as I was talking about before. You know, how do we change the system? Maybe a lot of it has to be, there is always that reliance or a dependence on it happening from the top down, but actually it's got to happen from the bottom up at the same time. So I think there is an element that people could mobilize and make change at the local scale.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rai, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, I think NGOs and other similar organizations and even institutions like this need to bring this home to ordinary people and civil society. I think there needs to be an understanding of the relationship of the human being to environment at a much deeper cultural level among people. And for instance, I've said before that if you take Hindus, they won't eat beef. It doesn't matter what sort of rational and GDP logic you say, they won't eat beef. And Muslims won't eat pork. It doesn't matter what scientific evidence you bring and say this is safe now. And similarly, Jews won't eat pork. And governments tend to, and we for instance wear turbans, and governments bend their rules to that. And I think that sort of a ownership of the environment needs to be more widespread in the public. So when they start thinking of voting, as you rightly said, or challenging policies that governments introduced, they're challenging from a deeper relationship with the environment, just as they have in their other cultural identities and issues and practices. I think then we perhaps can force governments to change more rapidly. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. Thank you very much, Professor Mistry. I'm going to pass you over now to my colleague, Ms. Bethan Walters, who's going to ask you a few questions on inclusion and diversity related matters. Ms. Walters.
Thank you, Professor Mistry. So you've already touched on the importance of looking at Indigenous knowledge systems. So with that being said, can you please explain why it is important to recognise that looking at environmental issues from a GDP perspective is only kind of perspective is not only counterproductive, especially when it comes to tackling various issues surrounding climate change, but why this colonial mentality can also be a kind of a bar to track the many issues surrounding diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think it's because we you know, I suppose there's two aspects to that. One is that, as we've talked about before, different groups of people from different parts of the world or different ethnicities have different ways of looking at the world, and that has to definitely be incorporated into the way that we think about climate change and these different environmental issues. At the same time, these different groups of people also have different vulnerabilities to climate change and to other kinds of environmental issues, and potentially different types of environmental hazards as well. And I think we need to really think about the fact of those two perspectives there. So there's a perspective of kind of like how different groups of people can contribute and important, but also how the different people are vulnerable to these different kinds of issues, you know, not necessarily in the terms of, you know, we've seen it in the pandemic, for example, of the kind of different groups of people and how diversity has been very important in terms of thinking about how the pandemic has affected different people and how different people are vulnerable to that. So I think it's really important to be able to think about both those aspects, the kind of the positive contribution, but also to think about the vulnerabilities of different groups of people.
Thank you. That was really nicely put. Dr. Rai, would you like to add anything or put your own spin on it?
Yeah, I think one of the problems in our world is that there is only one route to financially secure oneself and to have a reasonable life, and that's within the framework of modern pursuit of money and careers and things like that. There aren't inclusion of alternative ways and approaches, and it's a very difficult subject to think how a state can become a bit more pluralistic in its approach. But I think we need to bring the different wisdoms, different cultural ideas on the table, particularly at this juncture where we are facing this existential crisis with the climate, and to respect different ways of life that are not just cosmetic, let's say, dress and religious practices, but more deeper than that.
Thank you. So the next question is, how does the education system in the UK need to be altered to ensure that that it is actively engaging children and young adults in biodiversity matters, particularly when it comes to ensuring that there is a drastic change in the way we treat our homes, our neighbours, and each new generation to come? Professor Mistry, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I suppose having just had my daughter just finished school, actually. She's just going to university, got her A-levels results yesterday, and my son the year before. So we've kind of just finished with the school system. So we kind of have quite a good knowledge of the UK school system. And I'd say one of the biggest issues has to be the very kind of focus on discipline, on different disciplines, different topics, and also the kind of, it's all about the exams and getting jobs, basically. That's the kind of the two things there. And, you think, if we want to prepare our children for the future, for climate change, which is going to happen regardless of what we do now, it's just depends on whether it's not too bad or it's really bad. Okay, so we've got to prepare people for that, prepare our children for that. Schools are not doing that, as well as not thinking about all the other issues like biodiversity extinction, etc. It's all about exams and getting jobs and fitting into the system, basically. And I think one of the things that we really need to do is think about how, what kind of skills are we giving? How can we teach a multiple of skills that we're going to need for combating climate change? So it's not just that we need, for example, engineers, or that we need people who can make renewables, but we're just going to need people who can deal with refugees, or who can deal with lots of different issues. And in a way, we need to have a much more, I suppose, kind of goes back to right to the beginning when I was talking about this kind of lack of joined up thinking, and about how all these different issues are actually part of the bigger system. So I think that's one of the things that we really need to think about, is this less focus on the kind of, I'm going to become really good at physics, or I'm going to become really good at maths, or whatever it is, but actually to become a much more kind of rounded person in terms of the kinds of skills that we have, so that we can cope with the different elements of whatever we're going to face in terms of climate change. And then I suppose the other thing that I would say is kind of being more critical of the system, so kind of thinking about getting children to think about, where does food come from? Where does our energy come from? Where do we bank, for example? Just thinking about, okay, the bank that you use, who do they invest in? Are they investing in fossil fuel companies, etc.? So actually getting children to be much more critical in terms of thinking about how the system is being maintained, and how it's, how can we then counter that, basically. So I would say, yeah, and I say that those are some of the things that me and my husband have definitely criticized the school that our children have been to a number of times, and tried to give them some ideas on how things can be done, but it hasn't really worked, I have to say. I think they've probably seen us more as a nuisance than benefit.
It's interesting you mentioned the banks as well. We spoke to Extinction Rebellion last week, and they mentioned the same thing. To make small changes would be to do something like that and challenge where you bank and what you invest in.
Exactly.
But yes, hopefully something does change. I think hopefully with the next generation, that's something that will be challenged more and more as well.
Yeah.
Dr. Wright, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think it will be useful, just as there was quite a push in the area of philosophy to try and complement different interfaith or religious teachings with secular philosophy and modern philosophy. I think it's time now in the whole environmental, even things like biology, etc., to teach children about how different communities have had sort of traditional recycling systems, conservation systems, ecological relationships and things like that. And a child can grow up with an understanding of what already existed and what has worked and where the modern world is going wrong. I think one of the things where we have never, well, it's only now becoming more clear, but we've engaged as a human society in production without thinking where the produce is going to end. It's ended up in the sea, in the oceans, in various places where it's causing more harm than, you may have had a tin of beans, well, where's the tin going? If it's a plastic tin, you may have had a Coca-Cola, where's the bottle going? Those things were never paid attention to, whereas traditional societies always paid attention to where the end product is also going. That sort of thinking needs to be brought into school systems now, I think, yeah.
Sure.
Thank you, both of you. That was really nicely answered. I'll pass you both on now to Carlos to wrap up, but thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Bethan. My final question today, panelists, is there one small thing that we could all do or all adopt into our daily routines that would significantly help to mitigate and adapt to the negative impacts of climate change? And Professor Mistry, if I could ask you to go first.
Yeah, I think I'm going to sound like a stuck record because I'm just going to say that I think for me, one of the big things that people can do on a daily basis is really question where things come from and what they're doing, so going back to exactly what we were talking about, where do they buy their things from? Which companies do they buy there? Who do they invest in? And who do they bank with? It's like being much more critical about the things that we use in our everyday lives. And I think that is a first step in any kind of action. For me, okay, changing your light bulbs, doing your recycling or whatever, it's a drop in the ocean, really. It's not going to change the system. You're just doing a small action there. Really, if you want to change the system, you've got to become much more critical and knowledgeable about the things that are affecting you and your family and your neighbors and your community. And then that's the first step in then being able to change the system.
I completely agree. Thank you very much. And Dr. Wright, could I ask you the same question?
Yeah, to complement that, I would then I'd say that every time I buy something, I need to start thinking of where is it going to end? Apart from the content of food, let's say other things, even if I buy a television, buy technological things, or buy any food within the containers, I need to start thinking of where is this going to end? Is there a way of processing this or not? I think if more society starts thinking like that, we would force a more ecologically friendly production.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright, and thank you very much, Professor Mistry. Well, that concludes today's podcast. Thank you very much for taking the time out of what I'm sure are very busy schedules to be here with us today. I only have a few concluding remarks, and that is, this podcast has been brought to you by the Sikh Human Rights Group. For more information about Professor J. Mistry and the Sikh Human Rights Group's environmental and diversity policies, please visit our website, the link to which can be found within the description to this video. Or alternatively, please visit our Instagram account at SHRG_NGO. I've been Carlos Arbuthnot. Thank you very much for listening.